Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers? Welcome back to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and kind of a follow-up from last week, where I began talking about hair bands and how in 1986, I became quite enamored with rock and roll music. However, there was a lot of other stuff happening in 1986, so I thought, like we did the 1979 and 1982, that we take a look at the music and movies of 1986. And here's what immediately jumped out at me. And it completely explains why Gen X views, I think, are very eclectic. And that we have a wide range, I think, of interests in music. And even the movies that we watch. And how some of the, I guess, Gen X artists that we'll talk about when we get into the 90s, people who were influenced by this time period, how that kind of manifested in the music they wrote and the films that they wrote and directed. So let's take a look at the Billboard year-end Hot 100 singles of 1986. And what immediately jumps out at me is that it's this very weird mix of some of your 70s artists in their 80s phase, as well as I always like to see who's on the charts multiple times, because that kind of shows, I don't know, that they really were a dominant act at that time, that they really achieved some level of superstardom. But what's really interesting, and we'll get into it into a minute, the folks that are in the top 10 twice, one of whom is legendary. Absolutely legendary. I guess it's not both top 10. Somewhere within the top 15, let's put it that way. The two top 10s that I'm mentioning, not an artist that we think of as having longevity. In fact, they broke up in 1990. So let's go through. Number one, talk about an earworm of 1986. I remember clearly the apartment that we were living in. And in the mornings while we were getting ready, so I lived with my mom. She's getting ready for work. I'm getting ready for school. So this would have been middle school. I remember this song being on constantly. Now, for my mom, these were artists that she grew up with all together. So number one, 1986, That's What Friends Are For. Dion and Friends, Dion being Dionne Warwick, with Gladys Knight, Elton John, and Stevie Wonder. See, I told you, Elton John, he's always going to be on there at least once. It's ridiculous, just the output. And this is just a collab. They didn't call them collabs back then, but it's a collab. It's really interesting. Number two. So we talked about the 70s. Talked a lot about Earth, Wind, and Fire. There's also the Commodores. Their main songwriter, their main guy, went off solo. Here you have number two, Say You, Say Me by Lionel Richie. Again, you have icons back to back. You actually have a couple more icons in just a minute, but in between, I guess you could say a one-hit wonder, Climax, I Miss You. So syrupy sweet. Oh my gosh. Constantly on. It's really not a very good song. But that chorus, I Miss You. Oh, it goes on and on in your head. So don't listen to it unless you want it stuck in your head. But number four, that's what I mean by another collab of legendary artists. And I actually forgot about it. I think I've heard the song a million times, and it didn't quite register to me that it's a duet. On My Own by Patti LaBelle and Michael McDonald. What a weird mix, right? I mean, I talked about Michael McDonald being one of the great blue-eyed soul singers, so in that regard, it does make sense, but just, I don't know, what a weird 1986 thing. Patti LaBelle, she of the crazy hair, always had some weird hairstyle, and Michael McDonald. It's cool. Boring. Very 80s song. Again, not something I'd probably put on my playlist, but I've been trying to put things on the Spotify playlist, whether I thought they were great jams or not. So here's where, in my estimation, it gets interesting. Because now you have a band that's in the top 10 twice. And here they are at number 5, Broken Wings by Mr. Mister. Now they are on here again at number 9 with Kyrie. Now what's curious is I didn't know that Broken Wings was written based upon the book by Khalil Gibran. Now Khalil Gibran is, amazing spiritual books. The Prophet, great book. But that's, it's interesting to me only because he wrote Jesus Son of Man too, I believe. Because Kyrie eleison, that's a very spiritual song. It's a prayer is how the songwriter actually described it. So their content and the things they were interested in, I find so fascinating because they had big hits with things that were literate and very spiritual. But Mr. Mister, here they are back to back in the top 10. And I just remember, I forget what class it was. It might have been music class at Washington Middle School. And that song was like the jam, like both those songs, like Mr. Mister, whoever the music teacher was, Justin remembers her name. But they were as massive a band as you can think of. And I kind of put them in the same, not necessarily genre, but them and Men at Work as being so specific to this time period and having these massive hits and then seemingly disappear off the face of the planet until nostalgia kicks in, which is when obviously Colin Hay of Men at Work kind of came back on the scene. So here's the juxtaposition. Mr. Mister is here twice, but again, in the top 15, you have legend. Whitney Houston. Here she is number 6 with Howell I Know, and again at number 11 with The Greatest Love of All. Greatest Love of All, just iconic. One of the great ballads of all time. And I remember, being in middle school and kids kind of joking, because in and of itself, it seems hokey if you're a teenager, right? Greatest Love of All. The children, but How Will I Know, such a jam. But I was doing a little bit of reading about this, and How Will I Know was actually the second hit, and The Greatest Love of All was first, but it looks as though How Will I Know ended up being higher on the end of the year charts, probably because it was a dance number. So, talk about one-hit wonders and just such a weird 1986 thing, just 80s thing in general. Number 7, Party All the Time by Eddie Murphy. So, this was with Rick James. So that's a whole other story unto itself. But Eddie Murphy has this massive hit with Party All the Time. It's just strange that, he's singing in that high register. Just such a strange thing, because I think so many people now, we don't think of him as Eddie Murphy Raw or Eddie Murphy's Delirious or even Beverly Hills Cop or 48 Hours. Kind of like family-friendly Eddie, Nutty Professor and Haunted House and all that Disney stuff. It's amazing to think the same guy had this crazy pop hit with Party All the Time. Just strange. Such a strange song. And then a song that I completely forgot about, number 8 is, I guess, the second big hit by Survivor, best known for Eye of the Tiger, Burning Heart. It did not ring a bell. I still haven't listened to it. I don't know. I don't know what that song is. Does not ring a bell at all. Number 10, obviously number 9, we already talked about Kyrie, is Robert Palmer. Robert Palmer was everywhere. So between the solo stuff and, Power Factory, something like that, with the guys from Duran Duran. This is Addicted to Love. That's still played on the radio all the time. So Robert Palmer has amazing staying power. Again, it's interesting. Whitney Houston and Robert Palmer both passed far too soon. They're both here back to back, but Robert Palmer was very much an 80s icon. Number 12, Secret Lovers by Atlantic Starr. I put that in the same category as I Miss You by Climax. One-hit wonders galore. To me, not a re-listenable song. 13 is Friends and Lovers by Gloria Loring and Carl Anderson. I don't know what that song is. I'll have to go and listen to it because no clue. Absolutely no clue. Peter Cetera. Glory of Love. The songs are catchy. His voice grates on my nerves. I mean, it's a powerful voice. It's a strong voice. I hate the tone of it. I do not enjoy Chicago era Peter Cetera or solo Peter Cetera. I think the only thing I like by him is that jam with Amy Grant. And then, again, you want to talk about such a part of the era. The Pet Shop Boys with West End Girls. That is one of those songs that you just say, along with Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark and Soft Cell, Pet Shop Boys. That is a very... It's weird. I actually thought that song came out earlier than it did. I would have put that at 82, 83, but no, here it is, 1986. It's just strange to think that I was in middle school when the Pet Shop Boys came out. Well, I guess they came out around the same time as Frankie Goes to Hollywood, right? Interesting. Again, not something I listened to a ton. I think they had another hit or two later on. I think they had a brief resurgence in the 2000s or something like that. Another guy who was on the charts a bunch in that time, Billy Ocean. Billy Ocean. There'll be sad songs to make you cry. Not really great. But then a band that I think everyone thinks of another song that they did that was a huge hit and from a soundtrack of a very famous movie. So sometimes I forget about this song being as big a hit as it was, because I think they get generally regarded as a one-hit wonder. But that's Simple Minds with Alive and Kicking. Everyone thinks of Don't You Forget About Me, but here they are with another hit in 1986. So I'm just going to get through this top 20, and then I'm going to jump around a little bit. Heart's on the chart. This was their, for lack of a better term, hairband era Heart with Never. And then another icon. Actually, back-to-back icons. Wow, back-to-back-to-back icons. Holy cow. Now this is really interesting to me, because there's a whole section here where it's not one-hit wonders. Just listen to this. It goes, Heart, Prince and the Revolution, Steve Winwood, Huey Lewis and the News, Simply Red, Peter Gabriel, and Starship. All right in a row. I mean, that is a tremendous mix. And most of it is in the pop and R&B, some blue-eyed soul in there. So Prince and the Revolution is here with Kiss. Let's be honest. If you could talk about cover songs, oh my gosh, why am I drawing a blank on his name? Jones. Oh my gosh. Wow, I feel really embarrassed because this is an artist that my grandma saw in concert and absolutely loved him. And I'm totally drawing a blank at his name. Oh my gosh. And it is not even coming up. Tom Jones. Why could I think of Tom? Tom Jones. I was thinking George Jones. He's a country star. But Tom Jones' version of Kiss is so good. Like, so good. Could you talk about a juxtaposition of Prince doing all